Hey guys, Nate Morris here, MasterLSAT.com. We're going to look at PrepTest 90, Section 2, question number 10. Let's take a look. Question number 10 is a flaw question. How is the argument most vulnerable to criticism? So let's read the argument and see what's wrong with it. So it says, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Swahili civilization built tombs with large pillars and paneled facades. And these structures are widespread among the Oromo people of Somalia and Kenya, but are totally unknown among any other people with whom the Swahili had contact with. So in other words, the Swahili are doing it and the Oromo are doing it. And that's it. No other people that had contact with the Swahili are doing it other than the Oromo. And the conclusion says, therefore, this indicates that Swahili culture was at least partially influenced by Oromo culture. Now, what's the first thought you have about this argument? What's wrong with it? It's an asymmetrical argument because we know that we have these two cultures that were in contact with each other and they both did the same thing. And the argument says, oh, you know what must have happened? Swahili culture must have been influenced by Oromo culture. The Oromo must have done this large pillar paneled facade thing first, and then they influenced the Swahili, and the Swahili got it from the Oromo. Well, how do you know that that's the direction it went? How do you know that they got it from them? Maybe the Oromo got it from the Swahili, or maybe they both figured it out independently of one another, right? So this is an asymmetrical argument. It's always good to keep score as you're reading the paragraph. Think to yourself, based on what we know so far, what should the conclusion say? What would a good conclusion be? Well, a good conclusion might be, this indicates that one of these cultures influenced the other one, right? Because Swahili did it, and only this one other culture that had contact with the Swahili, that's the only other culture that did the same thing. So it sounds like one of them influenced the other one. But the conclusion says, therefore, the Swahili was influenced by the Oromo. Not necessarily the case. Maybe the Oromo was influenced by the Swahili. So that seems to be the flaw. It sort of goes in this one direction when it could have just as easily gone in the other direction. So therefore, let's look for that in the answer choices. A is neither here nor there because A says, well, what if the Oromo people didn't use these structures as tombs, right? It fails to address the possibility that maybe they didn't use it as tombs. Who cares what they used it for? The bottom line is, according to this paragraph, the Oromo are the only other civilization in the area that they had contact with, the Swahili had contact with, that made structures that looked like this, large pillars and paneled facades. Whether they use them as tombs or whether they use them as churches or schools, it doesn't really matter. It's irrelevant because they're the only other civilization that did this. What they chose to use it for has nothing to do with this argument, and therefore A is irrelevant. B is a little tricky, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the argument. B says that this argument concludes that because one thing, one event happened earlier than another event, that the first one caused the second one. Now, first of all, there's no events that we're dealing with in this paragraph. The paragraph is dealing with two civilizations that both do a certain thing. Now, there's no event, there's no sort of one thing that happened in one civilization and one thing that happened in another civilization. It's rather just characteristics or things or cultural activities that these two cultures do. There's no event in time. And also, there's no evidence that one thing happened before the other, right? In fact, that's sort of what's wrong with this argument to begin with, is that it assumes that the Oromo did this thing first, these paneled facades, large pillars, etc., that the Oromo did this first and then the Swahili got it from them. So it falsely assumes that, right? B says it concludes simply because one thing happened before the other. Well, wait a second. No, we don't even know that that's true, right? We don't even know that this happened before that, right? We don't know that the Oromo did it before the Swahili. That in and itself is sort of the flaw here, is assuming that the Oromo did it first and the Swahili got it from them, right? And also, like we said, it's not event. It's not an event that happened. It's the fact that they do this thing. And therefore, B is wrong for a few reasons. It's kind of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. C doesn't really make sense. C says that the argument's flawed because it draws a restricted conclusion, whereas the premises provide strong support for a much broader conclusion. Now, first of all, even if it did that, that wouldn't make it a flawed argument, right? That would just make it a conservative argument. If we have premises that support a really broad conclusion, and we sort of take a step back and we say, well, we're not going to make a conclusion that broad. We're just going to make a much more restricted conclusion. That's not a bad argument. That's just a conservative. We're just sort of playing it safe. We're going to just make this restricted conclusion, even though maybe we have the support to make a much broader conclusion. So that wouldn't even be a flaw to begin with. But obviously, either way, it doesn't even apply to this argument anyway, right? Because this argument doesn't make a restricted conclusion. There's no broader conclusion that could have been made here that it didn't make, right? So it doesn't really seem to fit. Like, what would the broader conclusion be? The conclusion that we made was Swahili culture was influenced by Oromo culture. The broader conclusion would have been that Swahili culture was influenced by Oromo culture and 5 other cultures. Like, how does this even fit here? So therefore, this is definitely wrong. D is tricky. A lot of people pick this one. But this is not something that the argument takes for granted. The argument does not take for granted that there wasn't a third civilization that was responsible for creating the tombs of this type that the Oromo and the Swahili people do. Because even if there was a third civilization that created the first tombs of this kind, and then these 2 civilizations got it from that third one, it still wouldn't ruin the argument. You know how I know that? Because the argument says very explicitly that Swahili only had contact with Oromo and no other civilization that did this. So the Oromo is the only civilization that did this thing, the large pillars and the panel facades, that the Swahili had contact with. Now, even if D were the case, even if there were a third civilization, I know for a fact that that third civilization is not the one that brought it to the Swahili, because the argument says very explicitly, the Swahili, if it got it from anyone, could have only gotten it from Oromo, right? So even if there was a third one, well, okay, maybe the Oromo got it from the third one, but then either way, the Oromo still could have passed it to the Swahili. So it wouldn't ruin the argument, even if there was a third civilization, even if these 2 civilizations weren't the first people in the history of the universe to do this thing, even if they got it from some other thing, okay, but it would have had to have been the Oromo that got it from the other culture. And then the Oromo must have passed it on to the Swahili, because if the Swahili got it from anyone, then they had to have got it from the Oromo. The flaw is not assuming that the Swahili didn't get it from someone else, because it's impossible that the Swahili got it from some other culture, right? The flaw is assuming that the Swahili got it from the Oromo as opposed to the Oromo getting it from the Swahili, right? So even if there were a third civilization, it wouldn't change anything, because we already know that the Swahili only had contact with the Oromo. As far as cultures that do this thing, Oromo is the only one that Swahili had contact with. So therefore, D is very tricky, but it says that it takes something for granted that it actually doesn't, because even if this thing were false, even if there was a third civilization that did it first, well, then they must have passed it to the Oromo, right? They couldn't have passed it to the Swahili, so it wouldn't change anything, because the Swahili could still have gotten it from the Oromo. The argument could still make sense, even if this thing were not the case. So you can't say that the argument takes something for granted when, even if that thing that you're saying it took for granted, even if that thing were false, the argument would still work. And therefore, it doesn't take it for granted, right? If an argument takes something for granted, that means that it has to be true, that thing that I'm taking for granted, that has to be true in order for this argument to work, right? But that's not the case here, and therefore D is wrong. E is the correct flaw. This is literally what the argument does. The argument does kind of randomly, falsely assume or take for granted that the Oromo started doing these tombs with the large pillars and paneled facades sometime before the Swahili did, right? Because whoever said that the Oromo came first and then the Swahili borrowed it from them? Maybe the Swahili did it first and then the Oromo got it from them, right? So that was the asymmetry in the argument. That was sort of the logical jump in the argument, was we said, hey, look, there's these 2 civilizations that both do this thing, the Swahili and the Oromo. And the Oromo are the only ones that had contact with the Swahili. So therefore, the Swahili must have gotten it from the Oromo. Well, how do you know that? Maybe the Oromo got it from the Swahili. Maybe the Swahili did it first, and then the Oromo came next. So we're assuming that the Oromo did it first, and then the Swahili got it from the Oromo. That's what E says. E says we're taking for granted that the Oromo people started doing this first before the Swahili civilization did. And this is definitely what the argument does, and therefore it's the correct answer. The argument takes this for granted. If this thing were not true, if the Oromo people did not do this first, let's say the Swahili did it first. It says in the paragraph that the Swahili did it in the 14th and 15th centuries. So we're assuming that the Oromo did it sometime before then. But what if the Oromo did it in the 16th century? They only started in the 16th or the 17th century or whatever. Well, then that would ruin the argument. And therefore, E is saying that this argument takes something for granted that, if false, would ruin the argument. So therefore, it definitely does take that for granted, because it needs that to be true. It needs to be true that the Oromo did it first in order for this argument to work, because if the Oromo did not do it first, how could the Swahili have gotten it from the Oromo? So that's sort of one way of pointing out the difference between D and E, because I know D was sort of a trick answer here. D says the argument takes something for granted, but that's not the case, because that thing that D says that it takes for granted doesn't have to be true for the argument to work. But E says the argument takes something for granted that does have to be true in order for this argument to work. It just falsely assumes it takes this thing for granted, but if that thing weren't true, the argument would fall apart. That's what makes E the right answer, and therefore E is correct. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.